The dog's name was Kaiser. It was stamped on the faded brass tag hanging from his once shiny collar. For 10 years, Kaiser had been a soldier's lifeline, an unflinching partner, fearless protector, and silent confidant. He had served in 3 tours overseas, sniffing out explosives, clearing paths, and saving countless lives. But when his hips gave out, when his barks became a little hoarse, and his joints too stiff for the battlefield, the military retired him. That should have been the start of his golden years. Instead, it was the beginning of a slow descent into obscurity. Kaiser was sent back stateside to the care of his last handler, a man named Scott Rivers. Scott had been a soldier too, one who owed his life to Kaiser more than once. But Scott came home with demons, ones that Kaiser couldn't sniff out or scare away. PTSD wrapped its cold fingers around Scott, and he fell into a spiral of isolation. Taking care of himself was hard enough. Taking care of Kaiser became an afterthought. The dog ended up chained in Scott's backyard in a small suburban town in Tennessee. A heavy, rusting chain looped around an old oak tree was Kaiser's new world. He slept on bare dirt, his once strong body covered in sores. The heroic dog, once celebrated for his bravery, had become just another forgotten creature. Emma Morrison was running late that morning. She'd spilled coffee on her blouse, misplaced her keys, and cursed herself for agreeing to dog-sit her neighbor's yappy terrier. But as she drove down Pinewood Avenue on her way to work, something caught her eye. It wasn't unusual to see dogs in yards in this part of town, but the sight of Kaiser stopped her cold. The dog wasn't just sitting. He was slumped, his body heavy with exhaustion. His coat was patchy, more gray than the deep black and tan it was meant to be. Emma pulled her car to the curb, her heart sinking as she got a closer look. The chain around Kaiser's neck was so tight it had worn the fur away, and his ribs jutted out beneath his skin. Emma didn't know why she felt so compelled to get out of the car. She didn't have time for this. She had meetings, a job, and her own problems to juggle. But something about Kaiser's eyes, those deep brown pools that seemed to scream, "I'm still here," made her forget all of it. She grabbed the leftover bagel from her passenger seat and approached slowly. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, crouching a few feet away. Kaiser didn't move, but his ears twitched. Emma tore off a piece of bagel and tossed it toward him. He sniffed it hesitantly before swallowing it whole. That was the moment Emma decided she couldn't just drive away. She didn't know anything about this dog or his story, but leaving him there, chained and forgotten, felt unbearable. Emma spent the next 2 days figuring out what to do. She called animal control, but they said they couldn't intervene unless the dog was in immediate danger. She tried knocking on the front door of the house, but no one answered. On her 3rd visit, she finally caught a glimpse of Scott Rivers, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and unkempt hair. "Sir," she started hesitantly, "I noticed your dog outside. He doesn't look too well. Do you need help with him?" Scott blinked at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. "He's fine," he muttered, his voice rough and tired. "He's a soldier, tougher than he looks." Emma's chest tightened. "He may have been a soldier, but he's not fine now. He needs proper care. I can help if you'd like." "I said he's fine," Scott snapped, shutting the door. Emma stood on the porch, stunned and angry. She could feel the heat of her frustration rising, but more than that, she felt heartbreak. What had happened to this man? And what had happened to his bond with Kaiser? That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept circling back to Kaiser, alone in the dark, chained to that tree. She did some digging online and found an old photo of Scott and Kaiser in a military blog. The caption read, "Scott Rivers and his K-9 partner, Kaiser, after a successful mission in Fallujah." The contrast between the proud, healthy dog in the photo and the frail creature Emma had seen was devastating. She knew she couldn't give up. Kaiser deserved better, and maybe Scott did too, even if he didn't realize it. The next morning, Emma made a decision. She called in sick to work and packed her car with supplies: dog food, a first aid kit, and a soft blanket. She didn't have a concrete plan, just a fierce determination to help Kaiser and maybe, just maybe, reach the man who had abandoned him. As she pulled up to the house again, she noticed Scott sitting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes followed her warily as she got out of the car. "What are you doing here again?" he asked gruffly. Emma took a deep breath. "I'm here for Kaiser. And I'm here for you, too, whether you like it or not." Scott stared at Emma for what felt like an eternity, his lips pressed into a tight line. Kaiser, as if sensing the tension, let out a low whine from his spot under the tree. Emma felt her resolve waver under Scott's glare, but she stood her ground. "I'm not here to judge you," she said softly, "but Kaiser doesn't deserve this. He's done enough, hasn't he?" Scott exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I can't. I don't know how to deal with any of it anymore." Emma took a cautious step closer. "Then let me help. You don't have to do it alone." For the first time, Scott's hard expression cracked, revealing a glimpse of the broken man beneath. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling. "He was my best friend over there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for him. And now I can't even look at him without feeling like I've failed." Emma's throat tightened, but she didn't let herself cry. This wasn't about her. "You haven't failed," she said firmly. "You're still here, Scott, and so is he. That means there's still time to make things right." Scott didn't respond, but he didn't tell her to leave either. Taking his silence as permission, Emma walked over to Kaiser. Up close, the dog's condition was even worse than she'd thought. His paws were raw, his fur matted, and his eyes cloudy with fatigue. But when she knelt down and reached out a hand, Kaiser leaned into her touch, letting out a low, contented sigh. "Hey, big guy," she murmured, gently scratching behind his ears. "We're gonna fix this." It wasn't easy convincing Scott to let her take Kaiser. It took 2 hours of gentle persuasion, a promise to keep him updated, and an offer to bring Kaiser back regularly so Scott could visit. Eventually, Scott relented, though his face was a mask of guilt and hesitation as Emma led Kaiser to her car. The dog struggled to climb into the back seat, his stiff joints making every movement a challenge. Emma had to lift him, and even though Kaiser barely weighed 70 pounds now, it was clear how much muscle he'd lost. She spread the soft blanket across the seat and settled him in as best she could. As she pulled out of the driveway, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Scott was still sitting on the porch, staring at his hands. The first stop was the vet. Emma had called ahead, explaining the situation, and they squeezed her in for an emergency appointment. Dr. Sanders, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, examined Kaiser thoroughly. "He's severely malnourished," Dr. Sanders said, her tone grim. "Dehydrated, too. His joints are inflamed, likely from arthritis, and that chain around his neck has caused some pretty bad irritation." Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Can he recover?" "With proper care, he could improve a lot," the vet said. "But it's going to take time. He's been neglected for a while." Hearing the word neglected felt like a punch to the gut. Emma hadn't known Kaiser for long, but the thought of anyone leaving such a loyal creature to suffer filled her with rage and sadness in equal measure. Dr. Sanders prescribed medication for Kaiser's arthritis, gave him a round of vaccinations, and sent Emma home with special dog food to help him gain weight. "You're doing a good thing," she said as Emma paid the bill. "But make sure you take care of yourself, too." The first night at Emma's house was rough. Kaiser was restless, pacing as much as his aching legs would allow. He flinched at every sound and whimpered softly in his sleep. Emma stayed up with him, sitting on the floor beside his bed and stroking his fur whenever he seemed distressed. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." By the second night, Kaiser had started to relax. He still limped, but his appetite had returned, and he eagerly devoured the bowl of food Emma set out for him. She could see a glimmer of the dog he used to be, the proud, fearless soldier who had once saved lives. Emma also started researching Kaiser's history. She learned more about his military service, the missions he'd been on, and the lives he'd touched. It was overwhelming to think about everything he'd been through, but it also strengthened her resolve to give him the peaceful retirement he deserved. A week later, Emma decided it was time to visit Scott again. She wanted to show him how much progress Kaiser had made and, hopefully, convince him to take a more active role in the dog's recovery. When she pulled into the driveway, Scott was nowhere to be seen, but the front door was ajar. "Kaiser," she said, glancing back at the dog, who sat alert in the passenger seat. "Ready to see your old friend?" As she knocked on the door, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Something didn't feel right. The house was eerily quiet, and when she stepped inside, the smell of stale beer and unwashed laundry hit her like a wall. "Scott," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response. She found him in the living room, slumped over on the couch with an empty bottle in his hand. For a terrifying moment, she thought he wasn't breathing, but then he stirred, groaning softly. "Emma," he mumbled, his eyes barely opening. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and pity. "Kaiser's here. He's getting better, but he needs you. And you need him." Scott looked at her, and for the first time, she saw tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to be what he needs anymore," he admitted. "I don't even know how to be me." Scott's words hung in the air, raw and heavy. Emma stood in the middle of the room, torn between her frustration and a deep well of empathy. Kaiser, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, padded over to Scott. His movements were slow and labored, but his intention was clear. He nudged Scott's knee with his nose, then rested his chin on the man's lap. Scott froze. His trembling hands hovered in the air before finally landing on Kaiser's head. He ran his fingers through the dog's coarse fur, his touch hesitant at first, then firmer, as if drawing some forgotten strength from the simple act. Tears rolled silently down his cheeks. "I'm sorry, buddy," Scott whispered, his voice cracking. "I let you down." Emma watched from the corner of the room, her chest tightening. This wasn't just about a man and his dog. It was about two souls, both broken in different ways, trying to find their way back to each other. "Scott," Emma said gently, stepping closer. "You didn't fail him. You're here now, and that's what matters. But if you want to move forward, you have to let someone help you. Both of you." Scott looked up at her, his eyes red and glassy. "I don't know how," he admitted. "Then we'll figure it out together," Emma said firmly. One step at a time. Over the next few weeks, Emma became a fixture in Scott's life. She showed up every morning with coffee and a bag of groceries, refusing to let him isolate himself. At first, Scott resisted, his pride and shame forming a protective barrier around him. But Emma was relentless in her kindness, and slowly, his walls began to crack. Kaiser, too, was part of the healing process. As his health improved, so did his demeanor. He began to wag his tail when Emma arrived, and he followed Scott around the house with the same quiet loyalty he had once shown on the battlefield. The transformation was undeniable, and it sparked something in Scott, a flicker of hope, faint but growing. One afternoon, Emma suggested they take Kaiser to a nearby park. Scott hesitated, but Emma pressed on. "Fresh air will do you both good," she said, handing him Kaiser's leash. Scott sighed but relented. For the first time in years, he and Kaiser stepped out into the world together. The park was quiet, the crisp autumn air filled with the sound of rustling leaves. Kaiser seemed to come alive, his ears perking up and his nose twitching as he took in the scents around him. As they walked, Scott opened up in a way he never had before. He talked about the missions he and Kaiser had been on, the lives they had saved, and the nightmares that still haunted him. Emma listened without judgment, letting him unburden himself at his own pace. "I used to think I was invincible," Scott admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But when we came back, everything fell apart. I didn't know how to be normal anymore. And Kaiser, he was a reminder of all the things I couldn't fix." Emma placed a hand on his arm. "You're not broken, Scott. You're just healing. And healing takes time." As the days turned into weeks, Scott began to take more initiative. He started cooking meals, cleaning his house, and even reading up on how to better care for Kaiser. Emma watched his progress with quiet pride, though she never took credit for his transformation. One evening, as they sat on Scott's porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to her and said, "I don't think I've thanked you properly." Emma smiled. "You don't have to." "No, I do," he insisted. "You didn't just save Kaiser. You saved me, too. I was in a dark place, and I didn't think I'd ever get out of it. But you didn't give up on me." Emma's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze. "You did the hard part, Scott. You chose to keep going even when it felt impossible. That's something to be proud of." Scott looked down at Kaiser, who was sprawled out at their feet, his tail thumping lazily against the porch. "I think he forgives me," Scott said quietly. Emma nodded. "Dogs are funny that way. They don't hold grudges. They just want to love and be loved." Scott leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a feeling he thought he'd lost forever. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. One evening, as Emma was driving home from work, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. "Emma? It's Scott." His voice was shaky, and Emma's stomach clenched. "What's wrong?" "It's Kaiser," Scott said. "He collapsed. I don't know what to do." Emma's heart raced as she turned her car around. "I'm on my way. Stay with him, Scott. Just keep talking to him." When she arrived, Kaiser was lying on the floor, his breathing shallow. Scott was kneeling beside him, his hands gently cradling the dog's head. "He was fine this morning," Scott said, his voice thick with panic. "He even chased a squirrel in the yard. And then, this..." Emma placed a hand on Scott's shoulder. "We need to get him to the vet. Can you carry him?" Scott nodded, his face pale but determined. He lifted Kaiser carefully, his arms trembling under the dog's weight. Together, they rushed to the emergency animal hospital, the silence in the car broken only by the sound of Kaiser's labored breathing. The emergency animal hospital was a blur of bright lights, antiseptic smells, and hurried voices. As soon as they arrived, a team of vet techs whisked Kaiser away. Scott stood frozen in the waiting room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Emma guided him to a chair, but he sat stiffly, his leg bouncing anxiously. "He's tough," Emma said, her voice calm but firm. "He's been through worse. He'll fight." Scott didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the double doors where Kaiser had disappeared. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Sanders emerged, her expression grave but not hopeless. "Kaiser's having a crisis related to his arthritis and age," she explained. "It seems he overexerted himself, and his body couldn't keep up. We've stabilized him for now, but his condition is fragile. He'll need ongoing care, physical therapy, medication, and a more controlled lifestyle." Scott exhaled shakily, relief washing over him, though it was tinged with guilt. "I shouldn't have let him chase that squirrel," he muttered. "Don't blame yourself," Dr. Sanders said gently. "Kaiser doesn't know how to slow down. Dogs like him, they're wired to keep going no matter what. He needs you to help him find that balance." Scott nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll do whatever it takes." The drive home was quiet. Kaiser lay in the back seat, his breathing steady but shallow. Scott kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his expression a mix of worry and determination. When they got home, Scott carried Kaiser inside and settled him onto the dog bed Emma had brought over weeks ago. He sat down beside him, stroking his fur. "You scared me, buddy," Scott said softly, "but I'm not giving up on you. Not this time." Emma watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride and sadness. She could see the shift in Scott. It wasn't just about Kaiser anymore. Taking care of the dog was forcing him to confront his own struggles, to rebuild himself one small step at a time. Over the next few weeks, Scott threw himself into Kaiser's recovery with a level of commitment that surprised even Emma. He followed Dr. Sanders' instructions to the letter, administering medication, preparing nutritious meals, and even building a ramp to make it easier for Kaiser to get in and out of the house. But it wasn't just about physical care. Scott started talking to Kaiser the way he used to, sharing stories, fears, and even the occasional joke. And while Kaiser couldn't respond with words, his wagging tail and soulful eyes spoke volumes. Emma visited often, bringing supplies and moral support. She could see the bond between Scott and Kaiser growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just about healing Kaiser anymore. It was about healing Scott, too. One afternoon, Emma found Scott sitting on the porch with Kaiser at his feet. He was holding a photo, an old one of him and Kaiser in their military days. He handed it to Emma, his eyes misty. "Do you know how many times this dog saved my life?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I can count. And I repaid him by letting him waste away. I don't think I can ever forgive myself for that." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "Kaiser already forgave you, Scott. He never stopped loving you. Now it's your turn to forgive yourself." Scott nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the photo. "I'm trying," he said. "For him. For me." One day, Scott decided to take Kaiser back to the park. It wasn't the same carefree trip as before. This time, Scott brought a wagon to help Kaiser when his legs got tired. As they strolled along the path, Kaiser seemed content. His head held high as he sniffed the air. At one point, a little boy approached, wide-eyed at the sight of the dog. "Is he a hero dog?" the boy asked. Scott smiled, kneeling down beside Kaiser. "Yeah, he is," he said. "He's the bravest dog I've ever known." The boy beamed, reaching out to pet Kaiser. The dog's tail wagged gently, his eyes shining with the quiet pride of a soldier recognized for his service. Emma, watching from a bench nearby, felt tears prick her eyes. This was what redemption looked like. Messy, imperfect, but full of love. But life wasn't done throwing curveballs. One evening, as Emma was visiting Scott and Kaiser, a car pulled into the driveway. A man stepped out, a stranger to Emma, but not to Scott. His name was Jake Harding, a fellow soldier who had served with Scott and Kaiser. "I heard you've been taking care of him," Jake said, his voice gruff but warm. "I had to see it for myself." Scott greeted him with a firm handshake, his face lighting up in a way Emma hadn't seen before. The two men sat on the porch, swapping stories about their time in the military. Jake shared memories of missions he and Scott had been on, and how Kaiser had become a legend among the troops. "He's not just your dog, you know," Jake said, scratching Kaiser behind the ears. "He's a symbol, a reminder of what we all went through, and what we survived." Scott nodded, his gaze distant. "He's more than that to me. He's family." By the time Jake left, Scott seemed lighter, as if reconnecting with his past had helped him make peace with it. Emma stayed late that night, sitting with Scott and Kaiser under the stars. They didn't say much, but they didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. The days that followed felt different. There was a new energy in Scott's home, a quiet optimism that hadn't been there before. Kaiser was healing not just physically but emotionally. His tail wagged more often, his eyes were brighter, and the limp in his step had become less pronounced. And Scott, he was healing too. He'd begun making plans, setting small goals for himself and for Kaiser. One of those goals was joining a local veterans support group. Emma had suggested it months ago, but Scott had always shrugged it off. Now, though, he was ready. He called the number she had given him and attended his first meeting on a Wednesday evening. It was a small gathering in the back room of a local community center. Scott sat quietly at first, listening as other veterans shared their stories. Some heartbreaking, some hopeful. When it was his turn to speak, Scott hesitated. He glanced down at Kaiser, who was lying at his feet, his presence grounding Scott in the moment. "This is Kaiser," Scott began, his voice steady but soft. "We served together for years. He saved my life more times than I can count. And when we came back, I wasn't the man I used to be. I let him down. I let myself down. But thanks to some people who didn't give up on me, I'm starting to figure things out. And Kaiser? He's still saving me every day." The room was quiet for a moment before someone spoke up. "That's what it's all about, man. Taking it one step at a time." Scott left the meeting feeling lighter. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Emma, meanwhile, had been watching Scott's progress with a mix of pride and relief. She knew how far he'd come, and she also knew it hadn't been easy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Scott turned to her. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You didn't just help Kaiser. You helped me. You gave me my life back." Emma smiled, her cheeks flushing. "You did the hard work, Scott. I just gave you a little nudge." Scott chuckled. "A nudge? You practically shoved me." They both laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Kaiser, lying at their feet, thumped his tail in approval. Months turned into seasons, and life continued to improve for Scott and Kaiser. They became regulars at the park, where Kaiser's wagon was a familiar sight. Scott started volunteering at the local animal shelter, helping care for dogs who needed a second chance, just like Kaiser had. Emma often joined him, and together, they made a quiet but powerful impact on their community. One day, Scott received an invitation in the mail. It was from a veterans organization, inviting him and Kaiser to an event honoring military working dogs. Scott hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to face such a public acknowledgement of their shared past. But Emma encouraged him. "You and Kaiser deserve this," she said. "It's a chance to celebrate everything you've both overcome." Scott nodded, his resolve firm. "Okay, let's do it." The event was held at a large outdoor venue, with hundreds of people in attendance. There were speeches, awards, and even a tribute video featuring photos and footage of military working dogs in action. When Scott and Kaiser were called up to the stage, the applause was thunderous. Scott stood at the microphone, his hand resting on Kaiser's head. He looked out at the crowd, then down at his loyal companion. "I owe this dog my life," he began, his voice strong and steady. "He taught me what it means to be brave, to keep going even when it feels impossible. And when I was at my lowest, he reminded me that I still had something to fight for." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Scott felt a swell of pride. Kaiser wagged his tail, his posture regal, as if he knew he was being honored. After the event, Scott, Emma, and Kaiser returned home, exhausted but happy. As they sat together on the porch, Scott turned to Emma. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what's next. For me, for Kaiser. I want to keep helping other vets, other dogs. I want to make sure no one ends up where I was." Emma smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I think that's a great idea. You have so much to offer, Scott. And Kaiser, he's proof that second chances are worth it." Scott nodded, his gaze softening as he looked down at Kaiser. "Yeah, he is." The journey hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over. There were still hard days, still moments of doubt. But Scott and Kaiser faced them together, strengthened by the bond they had rebuilt and the support of those who cared about them. For Emma, the experience had been transformative, too. She had learned that small acts of kindness could have a ripple effect, changing lives in ways she could never have imagined. And as she looked at Scott and Kaiser, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for their resilience, for their courage, and for the reminder that no one is ever truly beyond saving. Years later, Scott and Kaiser became local legends. Scott founded an organization that paired veterans with retired military dogs, giving both a chance at a new life. Kaiser, now a senior but still full of spirit, became the unofficial mascot of the program, his story inspiring countless others. And Emma? She stayed by their side, a constant source of support and friendship. Together, they proved that even the most broken souls could find healing, and that love, in all its forms, could change the world.